Hey everyone, thanks for listening to Radiolab, and thanks for listening to Radiolab to help support the show. Listener contributions are the reason we can do this, so thanks.
Support for the Radiolab podcast comes from REI. Since 1938, REI has provided gear and advice to inspire, educate, and outfit for a lifetime of outdoor adventure and stewardship. Information in stores and at rei.com.
Oh, wait, you're listening?
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
You're
Listening
to Radiolab.
Radiolab.
Shorts! From
WNYC.
See? And NPR.
Hey, I'm Jad Abumrad.
I'm Robert Krulwich.
This is Radiolab,
the podcast.
Today on the podcast, we are going to revisit something that we explored once upon a time in a show called New Normal.
Should you guys talk to each other now?
Yeah, hello.
Who's this? In that show, we talked with a fellow named Brian Hare, who's an evolutionary biologist.
Yeah, that was...
That's him.
And he told us the story of a guy whose name was Dmitry Belayev.
Dmitry Belayev was a very famous geneticist in Russia. He was alive during World War II.
He was pursued by Stalin, had a very interesting life, ended up in Siberia, where he began
one of the most exciting experiments in biology.
What he did is he took a bunch of wild foxes in Siberia, and he kind of weeded out the aggressive ones.
You mean he killed them?
Shot them, yes.
And he did this for generations. Anytime a fox was aggressive to people, he would kill it, unfortunately, and then he would keep the other ones.
And in a relatively few generations, I think it was 10 or so?
Yeah,
10. He was able to create a kinder and gentler fox.
They had foxes that were attracted to humans.
Which you would kind of expect.
But the thing that really got us fascinated by the fox experiment was as these animals' behavior changed, their bodies changed too.
Here's that part of the show.
What was exciting and surprising was that these same foxes, they actually show a whole suite of changes that he did not select for on purpose.
Like, what do you mean?
Physical changes. These foxes, as they became more gentle, for some unaccountable reason, their ears, instead of pointing straight up, flipped over.
That's right. It was a big accident that they now have floppy ears.
The tails on a fox, which in a wild fox, they're straight, now
they have curly tails. They have multicolored coats that are no longer just gray.
The tips of their paws lose color. The teeth get smaller.
And their bones became very thin.
Their bones got thinner?
Yeah.
Yes, so what happens to the skull and the face is it actually becomes more feminine.
The whole animal becomes more delicate and more puppy-like.
Wow. This was really a surprise to us because, I mean, when you domesticate a dog, you do expect it to become nicer to people. What you don't expect is all this other stuff, that it becomes essentially a completely different animal.
Well, an animal completely, or certainly differently shaped animal.
Well, that's the question, really. How different is it?
Once you've become domesticated, in a household pet, is there anything in you, anything inside, that's still just a little bit wild?
Turns out our producer at the time, Lulu Miller, had been thinking about this.
Okay.
And she wrote an essay.
Which is not our usual style, but this is kind of fine.
Yeah, and it takes that question, what's left, what's wild that's left, and it brings it much closer to home.
Okay, so
Here's Lulu.
on most of his birthdays, Maureen would give Charlie a sweater. Maureen was my dad's coworker. Charlie was my dog. He was a little white terrier, a very active little guy, always snuffling around at something, barking, growling if you took his spot on the couch. But when we'd zip him into that year's sweater, he'd go completely still. And he'd get that same stillness when my sisters and I would sit in a circle around him and color on his white fur with magic markers. I used to think he was still like that because he was happy, content to be our little dog. But now, I don't know. Wildness glimmered up in him, though, from time to time. He'd chase after vacuum cleaners, growl at bongo drums, and suspiciously eye the dishwasher. But he was quiet mostly, stoic, a good listener, my dad's only friend through long stretches. My dad's a guy prone to the nostalgic and swoops of sadness, and I'd stumble in on him on early mornings, in tender conversation with Charlie, testing ideas out on him. "What do you think, big guy?" he'd say. "What do you think?" I imagined he was very lonely. Charlie, that is. Lost in a purgatory where he didn't belong. Okay, congratulations. You've made it this far in someone else's pet story. I promise, things are about to change. Because it's shortly after his 13th birthday. Maureen, I think, got him a little blue jean jacket with a sheepskin inside and Levi buttons, that Charlie got eaten by a pack of wild coyotes. Let me back up just a step or two. This all happened on Cape Cod, the easternmost tail of Massachusetts, where you can find beachgoers in the summer, Kennedys, I think, if you know where to look, and very few predators. A couple hawks, the occasional fox. But other than that, as the local fauna goes, it's pretty much Snow White land. Chipmunks, bunnies, skunks. Until the coyotes came. I was about 15 when we first started hearing about them, and for us East Coasters, it made no sense. Coyotes were symbols of the West, somewhere far, far away from Massachusetts, somewhere where the land was orange and wide and open. So I looked into it, and it turns out that for a long time it was that way. Coyotes, like big states and cheerful personalities, was a strictly Western thing. But in the 1920s, people started spotting coyotes in New York. And by the late 50s, they'd made it up to Massachusetts. Only they couldn't quite get out to Cape Cod. See, Cape Cod is literally cut off from the rest of Massachusetts by a canal that's almost 2 football fields wide. So for decades, the coyotes were kept on the mainland. Until one night, sometime in the late 70s, a pack of coyotes decided to do what the rest of us do. They gathered up their kids together for a road trip and crossed the bridge. Or possibly, some speculate, swam across the canal. But I think it's a far better image to picture them as silhouettes, walking in single file across the bridge, with a big white moon behind them. Arr! So, suddenly they were there, and they started multiplying. More and more sightings of them in backyards and on runners' routes. The local press started running articles, "Keep your pets in after dark." A cave was found, local lore has it, with hundreds of collars. In 1998, a 3-year-old boy was bitten. And then, my sister found a goose. Completely slaughtered, down on a dock by the pond. It was surrounded by a splatter painting of feces strewn so wide, she deemed it the of terror. Now, it turns out my family came to Cape Cod right around the same time as the coyotes. In the late 70s, my parents bought a cabin in the woods that overlooked a purple marsh. The cabin had a deck, and that's where we spent most of our time. We'd sit out there late into the night, watching birds, then stars. And that's where Charlie was the happiest, on the deck. He'd pace around occasionally, nails scraping the wood. But mostly he'd just flop down with a sigh, a literal human sigh, and gaze out along with us. We never needed a fence, because he simply never left. When the coyotes first showed up, I used to like hearing them. You'd hear it as you lay awake in bed, the howls sometimes far off, sometimes right up close. And it felt thrilling to know that things were happening. Life cycles in grisly nature, predators, prey, right outside the walls. It used to make me feel like part of the earth. So, here's how it happened, from my perspective. It's late August. Sun is setting. We pull into the driveway, but we don't see Charlie on the deck. Immediately, I knew something was wrong. My dad said, "No way, everything's fine." But then we heard a whimper off in the woods. My mom and sisters and I jumped into action. We called for him, shone flashlights. "Charlie!" But the woods had gone quiet. And I remember this part very clearly. We were all standing out on the deck, craning our necks, listening for something. And just as my dad was forming the words, "Look, there's nothing to worry about. He'll turn up in the morning," we heard the yelp. So Charlie, that same noise he'd make when you stepped on his tail, followed immediately by the howls. I ran into a closet to hide from the sound. The next morning, there was nothing. Not a shred, not a collar, not a bone, not a piece of hair. They say one way